Good morning. We like the cover.
Yeah.
So the rabbi and I did a presentation about our trip to Israel, and some of you weren't here that day. So this is the Rabbi Goldberg and myself. So the Western Wall is a very ancient part of the city of Jerusalem, which is a very ancient city. It was built by one of the kings, and it was made as a platform for the Holy Temple. The temple was destroyed once, rebuilt, and destroyed again. So there is no temple that the Jews have in Jerusalem. And then a mosque was built on that spot, which really complicates it. But they have this platform, and they have this wall, which is like a retaining wall, which is kind of the remnant of the temple that is kind of holy to them. So people go to that wall, and you'll see American presidents and popes and world leaders will go to that wall as a place to pray. So the main thing about this trip was that it was a group of rabbis and Christian ministers traveling together. So that kind of gave it its character, and it kind of gave it its purpose. So there were 6 rabbis, and there were 6 Christian ministers, one of whom was a Roman Catholic deacon, the other were pastors. And this was a stop we made to a school that was started by a man and his wife, and he's in the middle. So we didn't have any Muslims on our trip with us, but we met some Muslims when we were there. So this man in particular, he's a Muslim man, he has a Jewish wife. And in Israel, the way the school system works is that you pick a language, Arabic or Hebrew, and that's your track from the time you're 3 years old all the way through school. If you speak Arabic, you go to this school. If you speak Hebrew, you go to that school. So effectively, it segregates the population into different cultures and into different languages and different religions, really, is what it does. So this gentleman and his wife, he was Muslim and she was Jewish. They wanted to have a school that would include both. And so they had to start their own school. And it's a preschool, but then they added on to it later on. So he had a very amazing story about how much he hated Jews as a young man. And kind of the story of how he kind of worked through that, not intentionally, but just in terms of the way things happened. And then just met this woman who was too beautiful for him to ignore, and how he had to marry her. So he had a very interesting story, and he created this school, which is a very interesting school. So that's our group, and that is the gentleman in the middle. This is our tour guide. And to be a tour guide in Israel during war means you're not getting a lot of work. So we're probably one of the like 3 of the groups that she'll have for a year, that she has people coming to show them around. This was in Tel Aviv. We were in Jerusalem, then we went about an hour east to Tel Aviv, and then we went about an hour south to what's called the Gaza envelope. And she was our guide. She's actually from, I want to say maybe Poughkeepsie or someplace, but she's been living in Israel for many years now. So this is the gentleman I was telling you about. So that's him and his wife. And so they have a school called the Orchard of Abraham's Children. The idea that Abraham had children, and those children are now Jewish and Christian and Muslim, but they all go back to Abraham. So this is him meeting with us. So we all kind of sat on the floor at a number of meetings. So that's kind of a Middle Eastern style of just kind of gathering and sitting on a rug. I sat on a chair because my back bothers me. But everybody else, we sat down, and of course they bring you out some refreshment while you're there. Then there was another school we went to, which was started 26 years ago. So unlike Abraham's Orchard, which is a private school, this is a public school, but it's kind of like a charter school, in that people come up with an idea for a school, and they start it, and they get public funding. So this is another school that had the idea of integrating the languages. That if Hebrew is your first language, you're going to learn Arabic as a second language and vice versa, and you're going to go to the same school. And the way they make that work is that they have 2 teachers in every classroom. They have one whose first language is Hebrew and one whose first language is Arabic, which means it's a very expensive school. So that while they get public funding, they have a bigger budget than the average school, which just has 1 teacher. So they have to do a lot of fundraising to support that. So she took us around a high school, which was very interesting. So she was a Muslim woman, and everyone has pairs that they're matched with in terms of language, but sometimes that results in being a different religion. So she talked about what it's been like going through this war and having yourself in a classroom where some of the children are Jewish, some are Muslim, some are Christian, and how difficult it is when the larger society is going through a lot of tension, that shows up. And she talked about how there were some instances of people who worked at the school who had to leave because they couldn't just deal with that tension anymore. So this was a woman who had a very interesting story. I don't know if you remember in the 1990s, there's long been a community of Jews in Ethiopia. And when Israel began in 1948, they said that any Jewish people around the world had a right to return and to become citizens of this country. And they told the Jewish community in Ethiopia that if you can get yourself here, you can be here and you can be a citizen. But not a lot of them had the wherewithal to get there. So then at one point they told them, if you get to the coast, if you get to Tripoli or someplace, we'll get you a boat to Israel. But not many people were able to do that. In the 1990s, there was a famine in Ethiopia. And so there was an extra effort made to airlift people from Ethiopia to Israel to live there. So this woman told us about the story. So she's, I guess, 26 years old, 27 years old, just at the time of that airlift, that her mother was 9 months pregnant. And while they were doing this special effort to airlift people, you had to get yourself to the airport, which in some instances was an hour away. So her mother and her father walked through the desert. So if you can kind of picture Joseph and Mary with the donkey, kind of going through the desert, except you don't have a donkey, which Mary probably didn't have a donkey. And her mother went into labor while they're halfway through the desert and gave birth to her. Her father told her years later that he didn't think that they were all going to make it, that one of them was going to die, maybe even both of them, in terms of the mother and the child. So her family has a restaurant now, an Ethiopian restaurant. If you've never been to an Ethiopian restaurant, there's a very nice one in Stanford that we can mention to you. And it's different, but it's very nice. It's worth trying. That's her aunt that was cooking in the kitchen. So she goes around talking about the experience of Ethiopians in Israel. She goes around the world. This is the bread that you get at Ethiopian restaurants. I haven't had anything like this anywhere else. It's kind of like spongy, and you kind of use it to pick up all your food. So this was a group of Bedouins that we visited. and some of them had an African background. So Bedouins are nomads. They're people who travel around. They don't have a specific settled place. So in terms of the government always has trouble recognizing a group of people that don't have a mailing address, right? You don't have an ID card that shows where you live. You don't have a P.O. box. So it puts them into a very obscure category. And she talked about herself as a woman. She wasn't always treated equally in the Bedouin community. And then the Bedouins weren't always treated equally in the Israeli community. So she talked about working for that and how she created a collective of Bedouin women. So she told us this story. This was one of 2 places where we did some food packing as a group ourselves because they send food out regularly. The same picture. And so we all sat on the rug, and she brought us all tea, which was delicious. And this was her son, who also works with their program. An hour east was Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is right on the Mediterranean Sea. It's a very beautiful, modern city. It has an ancient history, but a lot of the city is very modern. And it's very different from other parts of Israel. It's more secular. It's largely secular, whereas Jerusalem is largely religious. So it's got kind of a different culture, a different character, a different pace about it. So this was a church right there on the water called St. Peter's Church. There's a story in the book of Acts about St. Peter, about how he was given a dream, told that he would meet a centurion soldier and that he should sit down and eat with the centurion soldier. And then the centurion soldier is given a dream where an angel tells him, a man is going to come to you and he's going to tell you about your life and about the world. So they each have this vision, and then they actually come together. And it's kind of, the story is kind of where Peter kind of decides that he's no longer going to insist on being kosher if it means he can't sit down with another person and eat with them. So that's what the divine vision tells him, is take up and eat. Whatever somebody puts before you, take up and eat. And that's going to kind of be the mission of the church, is going to kind of go out to the nations and not to insist on a narrowly Jewish path. So while we were there, we found the home of Simon the Tanner. So a lot of these places is going back 2,000 years. You can't really be sure if this is the actual place. But people who own this place claim that this is the home of Simon the Tanner. And there's some evidence that people come up with. It's close to a well. You need a well. You need a lot of water if you're a tanner, because that takes a lot of water. So it's not actually being used at this time, but we kind of stopped by in there and they saw it. So that's the idea, that when you're there, that's where St. Peter's Church is, to remember that event. This is the house where Simon and where Peter and the centurion met. So I talked before about the temple and how the temple is this big open platform, and on it is the oldest piece of Islamic architecture in the world, the Dome of the Rock. The dome, we were told, was redone in the 20th century, and the King of Jordan, which Jordan has control over this area, the King of Jordan paid to have real gold put on the dome, and they brought in an Irish contractor to do that. So that's the Dome of the Rock from a distance. This is actually across the valley on the Mount of Olives. And there's a large cemetery there on the Mount of Olives. There's a belief that when the Messiah returns, the Messiah is going to come to the Mount of Olives, and those people are going to be resurrected. So a lot of people want to be buried in this cemetery. You could say people are dying to get in there. Sorry. So in Jerusalem, in the Old City, there are places that represent where Jesus was put on trial, where Jesus was tortured, the way that Jesus walked to get to his crucifixion, the place where he was buried. A lot of these places, the evidence is kind of sketchy in terms of whether it really represents that. But clearly you're in the Old City of Jerusalem, and this is where it happened. So whether or not this is where the trial was, whether or not this is where the crucifixion was, they're actually competing claims about those things. But to go there and to have a place where you can remember those events is very important. So the way along those different stops is called the Sorrowful Way, the Via Dolorosa. And it has kind of a Catholic Stations of the Cross as you go along. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is operated by Armenian Christians and Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians and like 2 other groups of Christians who don't get along with each other at all. So they fight so much about it that they needed someone outside to come in. And at some point when the Muslims were in control of Jerusalem, they said, we're going to give the keys to a Muslim family. And they're going to open the doors and they're going to close the doors. And they're going to schedule who's going to use the space on what day, at what time. So to this day, centuries later, there's a Muslim family that holds the keys and that goes every morning to open it up. Because the Christians can't work out with each other. Who's going to come on Tuesday? Who's going to lock up? Who's going to clean? Who uses this corner? Who uses that corner? So this is a little bit further away, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So this church goes back to the 4th century. Emperor Constantine's mother went to Jerusalem and she asked people, where did these things happen? She went all around Israel asking people, where did Jesus live? Where did Jesus die? Where did this happen? Where did that happen? And people were happy to tell her, it's right here, it's in my house. So that's the 4th century, which is pretty ancient and could be within memory. So some people think that's a pretty strong claim to go back that far. Obviously, this church is something that was built on top of that place. So it doesn't really look like what it looked like in Jesus' day. So I don't know if you can see the ladder. There's a ladder that's leaned against that window. That ladder was put up there before the Declaration of Independence. That ladder has been there for over 200 years. Somebody put it up and nobody knows who did it, and they weren't supposed to do it because nobody's supposed to make any decisions or do any work on the building without everybody agreeing to it, which of course means that nobody ever agrees to anything being done. So somebody came in one day and they're like, who put that ladder there? And they're like, I don't know, I don't know what they did. So that ladder has been there for 200 years. No one ever claimed that they put it there, and no one is allowed to remove it. So they have this status quo that nobody can make any decisions about the building unless everybody agrees, which means that nothing gets done, and that ladder can't be put away. 200 years sounds like a long time for us, but for them, I mean, this spot is from the 4th century, that's last week, right? So when the Protestant Reformation happened, you already had the Armenians and the Orthodox and the Catholics controlling that Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And when the Protestants got there, they're like, this doesn't look like a tomb where somebody was buried. So a gentleman from England actually went and found a tomb that was about that period, and that he believed that there was evidence to indicate that that location would have been where Jesus was executed and where he was buried. It certainly is an ancient tomb, so there's no way of really authenticating this. But from a Protestant sensibility, this looks like what you would want to see if you went to go see where Jesus was buried. So Lauren and I were there 26 years ago, and they've done a lot of work on it. They built this little entrance to kind of get you into the door, to kind of make it more accessible. All these planters and all these plants were just added recently. So it's still controlled by a British nonprofit, a voluntary nonprofit that controls the space. This is the Garden of Gethsemane. So this was a place that was kind of convincing that this is where Jesus actually went and prayed. We're told that it was on the Mount of Olives, and we're told that it was a garden called Gethsemane. And something that I didn't know was that the word Gethsemane means olive press. So they said there must have been an olive grove, and then there would have been something there to press the olives. So this was an olive grove on the Mount of Olives that had been there, clearly an ancient olive grove. So this was a very special place to go and to kind of think about that story and to kind of place yourself in that story. This church was built on that location in the 1950s, which means it's very new, right, in terms of Middle Eastern history. It was built by an Italian architect, and it had money from Europe and from the United States. So it's kind of a place that was built by pilgrims for pilgrims. So for me to go to this place, I mean, you could have a service there, I guess, if you wanted to, but to be out in the garden kind of represents more of what you would want to see when you were there. So everywhere you went, you saw reminders of the hostages that were being held. This was at the airport. When you got off the airplane in the airport, you saw pictures of all the hostages and kind of remembering that. So kind of realizing what the current situation is in Israel. And this is a couple of young children, very young children, who were taken hostage. And people bring teddy bears and stuff there. And this was in Tel Aviv. They had an area called Hostage Square. So there are lots of pictures all around the square. So this doesn't represent a place where something happened, but it represents a location across the street from the government. So for people who are trying to keep pressure on the government to find a way to get the hostages returned, this has been a place where they gather. We heard from someone who was a friend to this young man who went to school in Tenafly, New Jersey. So a lot of these people have connections to Israel and to the Northeast, to New York, New Jersey. And then this gentleman was found out after he got back, found out that he had died. When we were down there, we went to this place where they had a concert. And the concert was happening as the invasion happened. So this is a picture of some of the people who were taken hostage, who were killed at that event. So it was basically just a big open field. It wasn't like a concert venue per se. It was just basically a big open area in the wilderness that they had used for this concert. So this area has become a place where, if you remember September 11th, the way people were bringing candles and pictures and flowers, there's just people all around this area gathering every day. So you see pictures like this one, and we came with some candles to light candles to say a prayer. So this is telling you where you are, which they call the Nova site. So Nova is a reference to the concert that was happening. It's not really a reference to the site, but now they call it the Nova site. And it's telling you that there may be incoming missiles. So people in Israel, they have an app on their phone to tell them that missiles are coming. So while we were there were a couple of alerts that said missiles were coming, but it wasn't where we were. It was kind of in a different area. This is again in the Gaza envelope. It's an area called Ufakim. So we met people who told us about that day, October 7th, and what it was like for them. So this is one of the bomb shelters that they have all over the Gaza envelope. So it's basically a little cubicle that's concrete. And if you hear the siren go off, or if your phone tells you that rockets are incoming, you're supposed to run inside of this. So it ended up not being very good protection when people were actually coming across the border. But now people are going there to remember people who died in these shelters. So there's lots of pictures and flowers again. And again, this is the tomb. This is the inside of the tomb that the Protestants recognize as the place where Jesus was laid. So kind of the inside that tomb was a really kind of a special experience. Is it the actual tomb? We can't say, but it's certainly a tomb that looks like what you see in the movies and what you understand to be what you would see if you went to see where Jesus was. And after a week, it was a very quick trip. We were still friends at the end. And the rabbi and I, out of the 6 rabbis and the 6 clergy, we were the only ones who knew each other before going. And so the trip was an opportunity for lots of other connections to be made and to keep up those connections. And I think that's it. And that's my presentation. You can ask me questions later. Christ is the one who was handed over to a death he freely accepted in order to destroy death. He took bread and gave thanks. He broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body, which will be given for you." In the same way he took the cup, and again he gave thanks, and he gave the cup for all to drink, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. It will be shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me." Join our prayers and praise with all the saints, that we might live in the freedom and hope of your Son. Gathered into one by the Holy Spirit, let us pray as Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. The gifts of God for the people of God. So I've mentioned in the past that how we view events in the world really is mostly dependent on who we know, and if we know one person or another. So we have on occasion Janet Jacobson, who comes and fills in for us on the organ. And I think I've mentioned before, I think it's worth repeating, that she married a man from Pakistan. And I don't remember what his religion was, but it was probably Muslim or secular or something. And they had a child, and he married a woman from Israel. And so Janet Jacobson's son and daughter-in-law and grandchild are living in Israel. So she regularly has reports of how things are going for them, how many air raids they've had that day. Living here in Westchester, we have an opportunity to know people who would know people who are living there, maybe their own family or maybe they've been there. I also know clergy who are from Palestine. There's 2 congregations in Brooklyn that are Palestinian Lutheran congregations. So when you know those people, you hear from them. The Palestinian pastor was in Israel 3 years ago for a wedding. So his family's there, and they go there for celebrations. So it's obviously a very conflicted, very polarized situation. It can be hard if you know people on both sides to figure out where to stand in that. But I think for me, it's been important to kind of stay connected to those people. Whether or not you agree with one side or the other, to continue to be there for them and to pray for them. For me, going there was going there in wartime to say, this is a difficult time for the people in this region, and we want to accompany you in some way through that difficulty. So we can each look for ways to do that. I mean, if it's not Israel and Palestine, it's, your in-laws and your other family, and do they get along with each other? And people get divorced, and how do you figure out how to navigate those situations? So we all can see situations in our own lives and in our world in which people just have a really hard time getting along with each other. We can get caught up in that. Sometimes we need to take a stand on one side or another, but each of us has to make those decisions for ourselves. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you in mercy and grant you peace.